Something started to change without announcements or clear signals. Why did so many men start feeling like something didn't fit? Why do scenes that used to seem normal now generate discomfort? And how can a relationship slowly transform into a game where you always lose without understanding the rules? There is something even more unsettling. Clarity doesn't arrive with a conflict. It arrives when you start observing. Stay until the end, because understanding this pattern completely changes the way you see modern relationships. It doesn't happen overnight. There isn't one specific argument or a dramatic moment that marks the beginning. It's more of a small, repeated sensation that starts appearing in everyday situations. Something inside you observes a familiar scene and for the first time feels discomfort. You didn't notice it before. Now you do. Conversations that seemed normal begin to feel strange. Expectations you took for granted start to seem unbalanced. It's not immediate anger or rejection, but a kind of inner distance that forces you to look more closely. That awakening usually begins when the effort stops feeling reciprocal, when you start to perceive that it's always you who adapts, who explains, who tries to maintain emotional stability. At first you justify it. You think it's a phase, that all relationships have ups and downs. But the feeling persists. You start to notice patterns, arguments that end the same way, conversations where you end up feeling guilty even if you don't quite understand why, shifting expectations that seem impossible to meet. And the most disconcerting part is that externally everything seems normal. There are no obvious signs of a crisis, just a silent exhaustion that grows little by little, an inner voice saying that something doesn't fit, even if you don't know how to explain it yet. That moment marks the beginning of the change in perception. You stop reacting automatically and start observing. And when you observe, you begin to see contradictions that you ignored before. Because the problem isn't always in a single person. Sometimes it's in the dynamics that become invisible while you live them. And the more clarity appears, the harder it becomes to look at the relationship with the same eyes again. That is the beginning of the silent awakening. And the next step comes when you start questioning the standards you used to accept without thinking. When you start to observe from a distance, the first things that appear are contradictions. Situations that previously seemed normal now look different. Rules that apply to you but not always to the other side. Expectations that change depending on the moment. At first, you try not to give it too much importance. You think everyone is complex, that relationships require flexibility. But the more you analyze it, the more you notice a pattern. The balance isn't the same for both. Constant understanding is expected from you, but when you need the same, the response is different. Your mistakes are remembered for a long time, while those on the other side are quickly justified. Little by little, you start to feel like you're playing a game whose rules change without warning. And that sensation generates an uncomfortable question. Is it truly unfair? Or had you simply never looked at it clearly? The mind tries to find explanations. Maybe you should try harder. Maybe you're exaggerating. But the discomfort keeps growing because it's no longer an isolated moment, but a repeated sequence. You start noticing that certain conversations don't seek to understand, but to win. That some arguments end with the same conclusion, regardless of what you say. And the curious thing is that the more you try to explain yourself, the further you get from what you originally wanted to express. Clarity doesn't arrive as an intense revelation. It arrives as an accumulation of small details that, joined together, form a new image. You're no longer reacting only from emotion. You're starting to analyze the complete dynamic. And when that gaze changes, so does the narrative you told yourself about the relationship. Because the next step of the pattern appears when one person controls the emotional story and the other starts to question it. One of the most disconcerting things happens when you start to notice that the story of the relationship isn't the same for both. Not because someone is openly lying, but because the emotional narrative is built from different perspectives. Over time, some arguments seem to always pivot toward the same point. You end up being the one who must explain, justify, or apologize. Even when you try to express how you feel, the conversation shifts toward the pain of the other side. Little by little, your experience loses space. You start to feel like your emotions don't fit into the story. The pattern of victimization appears subtly. It doesn't present itself as a conscious strategy, but as a constant way of interpreting conflicts. Every problem ends with a narrative where one side suffers more and the other must compensate. And without realizing it, you adopt a fixed role within that story. You become the one who must understand, the one who must yield, the one who must repair. At first you do it for love, later you do it out of habit, and finally you do it to avoid conflict. The hard part is that this dynamic distorts emotional reality. You start questioning your own perceptions. If you express discomfort, it seems like you're attacking. If you remain silent, you feel like you're erasing yourself. The change in narrative doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens gradually until one day you realize that the version of the relationship being repeated no longer resembles what you actually lived. That moment generates a strange mix of clarity and exhaustion, because when you see the pattern, you can no longer ignore it. But you also don't yet know how to change it without causing more chaos. And in the midst of that tension, another element appears that complicates everything even further. The constant search for external validation, comparison, and the fantasy that there is always something better outside the relationship. And that dynamic transforms the way reality is perceived. Over time, you start noticing another, more subtle change. Attention is no longer completely within the relationship. Constant comparisons appear, external references, the feeling that there is always something better somewhere outside of what you are building. It isn't always expressed directly. Sometimes it's casual comments, small observations about other people, or an energy that conveys permanent dissatisfaction, as if reality were never enough because there is always a more attractive fantasy waiting outside. That creates a silent pressure. You feel you must compete with something you cannot see clearly, with shifting expectations that seem to feed on external images, social validation, or impossible to reach ideals. And when the fantasy becomes stronger than reality, the relationship starts to lose stability. Normal difficulties stop being something to solve together and become proof that perhaps everything could be better with someone else or in another situation. That feeling erodes the connection because you're no longer working from reality, but from constant comparisons. Meanwhile, you try to sustain what exists in the present. But the more you strive to prove your worth, the more the goalposts seem to move. External attention acts as constant noise that prevents appreciating what is actually there. And little by little, the dynamic becomes more fragile. The hardest part is that you start to feel continuously evaluated, as if something were always missing to reach an invisible standard. And when that pressure is combined with emotional arguments, the next step of the pattern appears: constant blaming and an increasingly distorted reality. Because when the narrative is no longer based on clear facts, perception starts to change. As time goes by, arguments start to feel different. They no longer seem like conversations to understand each other, but processes where the result is almost always the same. You end up feeling responsible for something, even when you entered the conversation with a different intention. Constant blaming isn't always direct. Sometimes it appears in the form of insinuations, selective memories, or phrases that make you doubt your own perception. You start to think, maybe I did react badly, maybe I exaggerated, maybe I should have done it differently. And little by little, your confidence in your own version of events weakens. That is what generates the distortion of reality, not because someone imposes a clear lie, but because the repetition of a narrative ends up displacing what you actually experienced. Every argument rewrites the story a little bit. You try to explain your emotions, but the focus returns over and over to your mistakes. The past is reopened when convenient. Your intentions are interpreted through suspicion while you keep trying to clarify what you meant to say. The problem is that the more you justify yourself, the more trapped you feel, because the conversation stops being about the present and becomes a battle over the correct interpretation. And in that territory, you always end up exhausted. You start feeling that you must measure your words to avoid being misunderstood, that any small mistake can become more evidence against you. That constant tension creates deep emotional fatigue, and the hardest part is that respect begins to silently erode. There is no exact moment where it disappears. You simply notice that you no longer express yourself freely, that you act more from caution than from authenticity. When you reach that point, the relationship no longer feels like a safe space. but like a field where you must defend your version of reality. And that wear and tear inevitably leads to a state of emotional chaos. Because when clarity is lost, internal balance is also lost. When tension becomes constant, the relationship starts to feel like unstable ground. One day there is closeness, the next distance. One moment seems full of understanding, and shortly after, conflict returns. That emotional roller coaster creates chaos because you never know exactly where you stand. And in the midst of that chaos, a silent problem appears. Emotional responsibility is no longer balanced. You start feeling that your main task is to maintain stability. You try to anticipate arguments, soften responses, avoid sensitive topics. Without realizing it, you become the emotional regulator of the relationship. But no one can sustain that role indefinitely. Exhaustion accumulates, frustration grows. And although you keep trying to act calmly, something inside starts to feel resentful. Because maintaining peace at the expense of your own clarity ends up generating a disconnection from yourself. At that point, respect begins to erode. Not always through insults or open conflicts, but through small, repeated dynamics. Not feeling truly heard, perceiving that your boundaries aren't taken seriously, or that your needs are sidelined. Respect doesn't disappear all at once. It wears down little by little. And when respect weakens, the nature of the bond changes. It's no longer about sharing growth, but about emotionally surviving the next argument. Conversations stop seeking solutions and move to avoiding damage. The hardest part is that both people can feel exhausted at the same time, each convinced they are doing the right thing. But when chaos becomes the norm, deep connection starts to disappear. Then a key moment arrives, a silent withdrawal. Not necessarily physical, but emotional. You start keeping more things to yourself, talking less, choosing silence because arguing no longer seems useful. And that silence, although painful, opens a new possibility. The possibility of choosing peace instead of constant conflict. But to get there, first you need to accept something important. You can't always change the dynamic. Only decide if you stay within it. And that decision leads us to the final step of the process. Withdrawal isn't always a dramatic gesture. Sometimes it starts in silence. You stop arguing about everything, not because you no longer care, but because you understand that continuing to fight within the same pattern doesn't change the outcome. You talk less. You observe more. And in that silent space, something appears that you hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. You start to see the relationship without the emotional urgency that used to cloud everything. You no longer try to convince, correct, or constantly explain. You simply recognize what it is. That clarity brings an inevitable question. Am I at peace here? When the answer starts to lean toward no, the need to reclaim emotional dignity arises. Not as pride or as punishment, but as respect for yourself. Dignity appears when you decide that your well-being cannot always depend on how a dynamic you don't control evolves. Emotional withdrawal doesn't mean hating or blaming. It means stopping the pursuit of something that constantly makes you lose your balance. It means accepting that sometimes the most mature act is not to insist, but to let go. And in that process, something important happens. You discover that peace doesn't come when the other person changes. It comes when you decide to stop living in constant conflict. Many think that walking away is a failure, but in reality, it can be a profound act of personal responsibility. Choosing tranquility instead of chaos, clarity instead of confusion. The end of the pattern doesn't always feel like an immediate victory. It can hurt. It can leave open questions. But it also opens up space to rebuild yourself from a more stable place. Because when you choose peace, you reclaim something you had lost without realizing it. The ability to listen to yourself again. And in that silence, a new stage begins. One where relationships are no longer built from the fear of losing, but from mutual respect and inner calm.